3 people, and you're going to have 4 weeks. Do something.
It started out of pure stubbornness, which is great.
Without necessarily meaning to, I think we found this quite interesting niche.
No, we did some stuff, and the fact that it's invisible means it works.
I think art is encoded knowledge and experience.
At that time, we were really fascinated by the whole transmedia concept.
That was it, not the time-travelling robot idea that we had.
Hello, I am Sam Fry and welcome to Technique, the podcast where we talk to artists about technology. Today I interview a writer, poet and creative producer. Here she is introducing herself.
Hi, I'm Vik Bennett and I'm a writer and immersive storyteller based up in rural Cumbria.
Yes, today's guest is Vik Bennett. Vik is a poet who has received a number of awards, including a Northern Promise Award for poetry, the Northern Debut Award, and the Waterhouse Award for poetry. Vik is also well known for having founded Wyld Women Press, where she provides a space for a community of women to share their ideas, stories, inspirations, and actions for positive change. Also, Vik is co-director of The Wizard and the Wyld, an immersive digital storytelling partnership, which she runs with her partner Adam Clark, who you might remember from episode 33 of this podcast on Minecraft art. In this episode, I have a great chat with Vik about her creative writing, about Wyld Women Press, and what it's like to collaborate on her The Wizard and the Wyld projects. But mainly we speak about a recent project of hers, Wyld Woman Gamer, a celebration of the inspiring women working and creating positive change within the gaming community. So, let's get into the interview, which begins with me asking Vik about how she began creative writing.
I think I've always written, one of those children who was observing from a very young age, trying to work out what was going on around me. And I suppose in that way I was telling stories all the time. And so writing became the next stage of that. And I was surrounded by books and poetry when I was growing up. So that was definitely influential. We didn't have a television. We weren't allowed TV or anything like that. Strangely, my mum and dad had the video game Pong. Am I thinking Pong? Anyway, that was the only thing we had in the house. So somebody must have remembering that, someone must have given us that, but we didn't have any kind of visual. We had cartoons on a reel-to-reel cine thing, and that was it. So it was just books. And then I suppose I was good at it, so I carried on doing it. And it was one of those things that I was encouraged to do, and I don't think I ever thought I would do anything else. I wrote poetry all the time, that sort of the famous line from the song, it's bad but intimate poetry, probably when I was in my teens. But I always wrote poetry and did short stories. I think I won a national competition when I was 13 for writing an incredibly depressing story about post-apocalyptic situation where everybody was trapped inside a school and started sort of systematically murdering each other, and that sort of cheerful thing that you write when you're 13. I think that encouraged me because it was a proper competition and there was a big prize giving thing, and then it was about 20 years before I won anything else, so it was a little bit of an illusion breaker on that one. But I left school at 16, so I didn't carry it on academically at that point.
And in terms of the subject matter of your poetry, what types of subjects were you writing about? Has that changed much over time?
I'd say I've always written from the personal. I say now sort of the teenage stuff, obviously there would have been a lot of teenage angst in there, but it's always basically come from the same place. It's experiences that I'm having as a human being, how I've observed them, what's going on around me. I've got quite a heavy sort of presence of a relationship with nature, whether that's nature of our bodies or nature of what's around us. My most recent book that came out in August, which is called To Start the Year from Its Quiet Centre, was written about caring for my mum through terminal cancer and her death, and I think that probably says quite a lot about how I write, because I write poems that were very close to the experience and talk about the actual process of dying, the physical process and the the emotional sort of letting go and the grief, but I don't really shy away from talking about the more intimate stuff.
Is that quite hard to do?
It's not hard to write, it's hard to share. I suppose when I write, when I'm writing everything really, but I suppose what I'm trying to do is get as close as I can to what the experience is like. So for me, poetry is very immersive, and although it's a pulling back of the language as far as possible, the purpose behind it is to try and invite somebody in to experience that as closely as possible to what I have gone through. And I think that's I suppose it may be very much about my experience, but by taking it down to that sort of intimacy, then I hope that it's also a shared experience, because we all know we're mortal, don't we? We all know that our bodies are going to have to go through this process, and nature goes through that process. And I think that we, in particular with that book, I was writing about it first and foremost for myself, and then in the process of crafting and putting that together as a collection of poetry, I was writing it for an audience at that point as well, and to share it as a story, and to take a reader through that process of coming to terms with what was happening, and then go through the process of loss and the sort of then the process of letting go afterwards, and that's taking someone on a journey, I suppose.
I won't say that I'm a massive poetry reader, but I think when I have gone to read poetry, quite often it is in those moments where you want to find a connection of some kind, or often that is quite melancholic. You want to be connected with someone that's had a similar experience or is feeling some similar emotions.
I mean, I've read some beautiful poems about some very, what would be seen, I suppose, as positive things, but I think that you're right that there is a certain melancholy in there. I always think of cauliflowers with that word. Sorry. It's one of those words that makes me giggle inside. But I think it's less about it being an unhappiness and more about it being a humanity, because even in things like, I've read some wonderful poetry about, for example, motherhood or parenthood, which may be that sort of very, very positive thing, but the poems may have something else. It's a kind of a lifting up the veil, and we're so often kind of in society we're trying to present ourselves in a certain way, and we have these barriers between who we are that say we have to behave in a certain way, or we have to not behave in a certain way, and poetry goes past those barriers, and it says, I'm in this world and you're in that world, but we've got this shared experience that connects us. And I think that's why poetry, more than anything, kind of connects people, for me, across cultures and across countries, and allows us to find our shared humanity, but also to learn something about another person, another person's world.
It's interesting, particularly in today's world, and especially at the moment, where people are living a lot more digitally because they can't necessarily go and see people, and so they're communicating digitally. I mean, we're recording this digitally, and online, there's a facade of this is who someone is. If you're on a social media channel, it's normally a representation of either part of themselves or a portrayal of a version of themselves. So actually, in every medium, there are ways of getting to a kind of deeper state, but maybe it's even more necessary given people view others through that digital kind of false lens.
It's been interesting to see what's happened over this last year, because apparently poetry sales have increased, which I think is quite telling. And given that poetry is, when I used to facilitate workshops in schools, and poetry would always be the one that, be invited in as an artist, a visiting artist. You'd stand in front of the class and say, and they'd say, well, and this, this is Victoria, and she's a poet, and she's going to be doing poetry with you today. And 20% of the class would be like, yay, and the rest would be like, oh, poetry. So I think it's got a bad rep to it, but it's also, like you say, it's a go-to place, and more people are purchasing poetry, are listening to poetry, and I mean, it's been interesting for me. I'm going to go off tangent here, but my life is quite limited in terms of what I can engage with outside of home, partly through being a carer and also through having chronic illness. So for me, this year I've actually been able to engage with much more than normal, and I have friends who've experienced the same thing. You know, I've been able to go and see performances and listen to live music and go to poetry readings and give poetry readings and talk about my work. Oddly, I think it's allowed a much more diversity in the arts this year, despite what's going on and despite the fact that it's collapsing all around us and we're supposed to just go and take paper rounds, because honestly we haven't been doing anything for the last 30, 40, whatever years that we've been working, developing our craft. But that's another whole topic. I've experienced a much higher access to things, and I think that because of that access, there's kind of an explosion of opportunities in telling stories digitally that wasn't there maybe even 12 months ago. Those people who've been involved in it have known that it's there, but bringing everybody else on board has happened very rapidly now. So I think people are going to be turning much more to it and going, well, how can we use this format? How can we use these tools to tell stories and connect with each other? But for somebody who doesn't have much access to meeting with people in the physical world, for me this doesn't feel like I'm distanced from you or whoever, because this is more contact than I would have been able to have otherwise. I started out going back, I don't think how long it's been, it's like surely not that long, going back to early 1990s, I suppose. I started out wanting to go into film, and I was training, doing media and video studies at a community studios. This is in the days where video really was video and you had to splice stuff and things. I was set to go to Bournemouth to study script writing, but they lost my application. One of those moments that changes the course of what I was going to do. And I ended up going and doing creative studies and community arts instead in Portsmouth. And while I was there, I had to do a year-long placement. And I worked with Survivors Poetry, which is a poetry organisation that facilitates workshops with people who are users of the mental health service. I really enjoyed that work, felt that it had connected me with it. I had previously been a user of mental health services myself earlier on in my life. And I could really understand the sort of value of that opportunity to connect with personal stories and to take charge of one's own voice and one's story and tell it. So sort of from that, I then got quite heavily involved with community arts, and I trained in arts disability, training for trainers, and for quite a few years then worked doing workshops, residencies with mainly sort of focusing around mental health work and arts in mental health. In that process of working, I found that there were many more women using the front end, I would say, of mental health services. So counselling, psychotherapy, pharmaceutical intervention for sort of low-level depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. And the more work I did, the more I started to feel that maybe if people, particularly women, my interest was working with women, but so maybe if women had more of an opportunity to get together and be creative and share their stories and feel empowered to do that, that less would end up in a situation where they were having to use the mental health services. So that's why I founded Wyld Women back in 1999, and that was kind of, I suppose, my impetus to do it. And it was kind of I woke up one morning and went, yeah, I know what I've got to do this, and drew out posters and stuck them to walls and said, do you want to come along and tell your story? And they did. I suppose alongside of that, I've done workshops in schools and taught at university, and so I've done the more sort of traditional side of facilitating creative writing, and I've done a lot of collaborative work with Adam, because we've been together a very long time. So I've always kind of enjoyed that bringing together of writing and visual work. So earlier on, we would do a lot of collaborative work which involved painting and drama and stuff like that. And then sort of more recently, obviously, it's sort of developed more into the digital side of things.
One of the reasons that we're talking at the moment is because of Wyld Women Gamer, which I think is something that's been working on more recently on that journey. Can you tell me a bit about that area?
Okay, it's Wyld Woman Gamer. I'm very confusing
Sorry.
because it's Wyld Women Press that I run, but it's Wyld Woman Gamer. I mean, that's a, sort of an interesting one as well, because obviously Wyld Women's been going for 21 years now, and its focus has always been poetry, creative writing, music, arts, kind of nature-based work, that sort of thing. Not gaming at all. And there's not one gamer in there. In the group. So why end up doing something that's focusing on gaming? So Wyld Woman Gamer came about, gosh, it was only the beginning of this year. It feels a long time ago. At the beginning of this year, I applied to the Winston Churchill Fellowship, which is a travel fellowship. And I applied to do a project called Wyld Woman Gamer. And the idea behind it was to be able to travel to Europe, places in Europe and America and in the UK to meet with women involved in gaming, whether that's gaming from the sort of playing side to sort of researchers and academics or game developers, or so sort of a wide range of women working within it, that to talk to them about why they were working games, where they saw their games placed in terms of that telling of stories and owning of stories by women, and how they felt games could be and were being used as a kind of an agent of positive change, I suppose, is the quickest way to say it. The idea was that I would come back with that research and then work with women in this community, you know, with the Wyld Women group and also other women within the rural northern community, to look at their stories and say, well, you know, how can you use this platform of gaming to tell your stories? The reason I started to do that was, obviously I live in a house where games are very prevalent. I don't think there is a room actually that hasn't got some kind of device in it. And I was very reluctant, really reluctant to get anywhere into gaming. I mean, honestly, when Adam and I were expecting Django, the thing that makes me laugh the most, I don't know whether you could put this in, but we had this antenatal session. We were asked to throw beanbags depending on whether we felt strongly against or for something, and it was to see how our parenting would fit together when we had our child. And it got to video games, and it was like the more you were against, you went left, the more you were for, you went right. My beanbag went way off to the left, and Adam's beanbag went way off to the right, so we were completely not compatible. And I said, you know, right, you know, we're not going to have any video games. He's not going to play video games. You know, video games are bad. Video games are evil. Well, not quite, but it's not healthy. It's addictive. It's all of the things that are said about gaming. And of course, I wasn't going to win that argument because they were there. Obviously, our son's there looking and going, well, what's Daddy doing? I'll just copy what Daddy's doing, because that's, you know, if he was soaring something up, I'm sure he would have been soaring something up, but he wasn't. He was playing a video game and making video games and things. So, and it was a case of had to choose really at some point whether or not I was going to walk away from it and say, right, that's it, you know, it's me or the video games kind of thing, or find out what it was about and say, well, okay, I don't understand this world. Show me what this world is about. Show me why this is important. And that's what I did. I went home and I said, okay, well, teach me about this stuff. Show me. And the more I found out about games and the more games I saw and got involved in, and the more work I started being involved in terms of researching for Minecraft projects and things, the more I started to see that this was a really powerful and a really playful, a really engaging space for stories to be told. because, you know, when I'm writing a poem, I'm trying to bring somebody into that experience and share that and find that place of connection. But in a game, that's even more powerful because somebody's actually involved in the process of going through that experience and making choices and really kind of engaging and connecting with it, particularly if it's immersive, like if it's VR and things, then it's even more so. And that really, you know, that kind of makes me go all sort of tingly and get excited about it and go, I want to be able to work in that medium. I want to be able to use that. But I look at a lot of the games and go, well, where's my sort of stories? Where are my stories? Where's my kind of voice? Where are the middle-aged rural women? And the more I looked, the more I thought, well, it needs to be there, because if this is a platform that is becoming and I think will actually surpass, you know, the medium of film, then women have to have voices in that. Everybody has to. There has to be a diversity of voices and stories. So then I thought, right, well, what was Wyld Women about? And that was about creating a space through writing and other arts for women to tell their stories. I want to look at gaming. I want to look at how we can use gaming, how other people are using gaming, and what other women working within games have got to say about that and their experience and why they're doing it and what are the games they're making and playing and thinking about. And again, very much a sort of a positive celebration of that. You know, there's a lot wrong with it. There is a lot wrong with the gaming community in terms of attitudes towards women, but the strongest way that I've found to change that sort of thing is to create the things that make people change their minds about it, because they see that if people are constantly playing games where women are depicted in a certain way, then it doesn't shift any of that narrative. You know, it's not that I think everybody that plays games is going to be a misogynistic, violent sort of serial killer at all. But you need to change the narratives. There needs to be a diversity of narratives for people to be able to understand that the games that they play are as much a reflection of who we all are and the differences and the similarities between us.
So I went to a gaming exhibition a couple of years ago, and it was about the process of making games, process of writing, and it had a few games.
Was it the V&A one?
Oh,
because there was the big V&A.
It was the V&A. Yes, it was the V&A. Yes, you're right. So I remember at that exhibition, they did have a section that was around diversity, and it had a few different people speaking about gaming and the gaps in actually the voices that are shown in gaming, and there's a few examples that are interesting. And that really stayed with me. Of everything in that exhibition, that was the one thing I came away thinking about. But I still think the gaming industry is very male and very shooting based or sport based still.
It's the marketing behind the gaming industry. The developers are there wanting to create, you know, men and women, you know, wanting to create interesting games. But unless the marketing people say there's an audience for that, then they won't get made. They get made by the indie developers but the larger gaming companies are going to shy away from them. But the problem is, it's a perpetuating thing, because if you say, well, there isn't a market for it, then the games get made that the people that there would be a market for the other type of games go, well, I don't want to play that. So then there's not a market for it. I mean, I've talked to the women in Wyld Women, and we said, well, what would you play? Starting from a kind of, well, what puts you off gaming to what would interest you. You know, if you saw a game that was this or that, you know, would you be interested in playing it? And that's kind of a much more telling thing, because what it basically says is there are people there that want to play these games. There's a huge, diverse audience, you know, who all sorts of things. But we're not interested in their money. We're not interested in them being part of this culture, because they don't fit. Even though I think it's something like 46% of people gaming are women, and the highest proportion of rise in gaming is in that 35 to 50 age group, you know. It's like, it doesn't fit. So if people can't see themselves, they're not going to feel that they can access games. If they can't see anything that represents them, if they can't see the people that they connect with, then they're going to feel outside of it. And so they won't play, and then they won't create, and then it just goes round and round and round. So I think I got asked in the Winston Churchill thing about what was I doing to change that, and I said, well, just sitting here I'm changing it, because I'm a then 48-year-old woman living in rural Cumbria who didn't have any background in games, saying, I want to change this.
And also, I think when people talk about gaming, you automatically go, okay, it's the big consoles, it's Xbox and PlayStation or PC gamers that are really into it. But actually, gaming is pretty wide spectrum as well. And a lot of people game, even without thinking themselves as gamers, by using an app on their phone or whatever. And so actually, the entry points might be different for different people.
And I think, that then comes down to also to access of, affordable equipment. What is it? I mean, the price of the new PlayStation, it's like, it's outside of our price range. I suppose it's the same thing as reading, isn't it? If people feel like with poetry, where we started off talking about poetry, if people feel like poetry is not for them because they believe that it's dead white males that write it, then they're not going to access poetry because they can't see themselves. But as poetry has started, it's still got a long way to go, but it's started to change. Different voices have started to come through. Then more people are getting engaged in poetry. I mean, I think there's a big upsurge of younger people buying poetry, reading poetry, and that came about through called the Instagram poets, putting poetry in a different platform, sharing it in a different way, talking about things that people went, yeah, I connect with that's my voice. And then suddenly there's a whole new group of poets, and they're writing in different ways. But again, I'm going to bark on about being the old middle-aged woman in rural Cumbria, because it's like there's an older voice that needs to be present, and it needs to be in there in gaming, and it needs to be there in storytelling in on all platforms, because older women have something to give in terms of experience, in terms of stories to tell. And it's very much an invisible world. There's a certain point where it's like, well, that's not of interest anymore to anybody. But of course, what about all the other people of that age who might be interested?
So with Wild Woman Gamer, what have you learned through the process so far across this year, and what are you looking to do around some of that work?
What's interesting is that there's a whole range. It's women who are working in games, a whole variety of people producing different types of games. And I'm not sure at the moment, because of what's happening in the world, my focus is on creating a space where those stories and those games and those experiences can be shared, which we're doing through a blog on Wild Women Press and through a newsletter, and just starting to create networks of people that are contributing to that. I mean, ideally, I would like to see that grow and evolve, and I don't want to kind of say exactly how that's going to be, because I think that's going to be dependent on what people want to do with it. In my blue sky thinking, I've got Wild Woman Games somewhere in there. I'm also, 2/3 of the way through writing a non-fiction work, which is not to do with games, and doing lots of other stuff. So that, like I said, that's a sort of blue sky thing. I want to raise the profile so people can start thinking more about the questions behind it. Like, well, okay, what are games? Can I connect with them? What do I think about them? Challenging that one's own kind of perceptions of games is important as well, because, I had to do it with myself, because I think that they are going to be such an important storytelling vehicle. I mean, I spoke to someone the other day and she said, well, it looks really interesting, that Wild Woman Gamer, but I'm not a gamer. And I said, well, neither am I. I don't have to be a games developer to be interested and to know the potential that's there. There's such potential with games to involve all sorts of other people, scientists and artists, and there's health, medicine, there's all these different worlds that can connect. So we don't need to go and say, well, games exists in this sort of exclusive world that doesn't connect with any of the other ones, because it does. It's got to be involved with those worlds, and the more people realise that it's accessible, the more those games will change, because people will start saying, well, I am interested, and either I'm interested, and this is my story. I mean, this is what I hope, really, I suppose, is that people will start to say, yeah, this is my story, and I want to tell that. So how can I tell that? And maybe that will be a really simple game that's made and can be played in very simple terms, or maybe it will be a really complex thing that involves an entire studio, or maybe two people might get together and say, well, we've both got this idea, and one of them might be technologically whiz kid and go, yeah, I can do this. But I want people to start, particularly women, to start saying, I want to tell my story, and I'm going to use this technology. I'm going to use these things that are there, and I'm going to tell my story, and I'm going to reach people. That's empowering, and through empowerment, we create positive change. So, I wrote a book about caring for my mother when she had mesothelioma. I also created a Minecraft map based on caring for her called My Mother's House. And people went, you can't make a Minecraft map about somebody having terminal cancer. And you can. And people came up to me after, when I put that out there and said, thank you for doing that. That helped me talk to my child about it, or that helped me think about an experience that I've had. But that's just me going, well, I want to share that experience, and I'm going to do it through that way because I can. Not because I've got skill in it, but because I've got a right to tell my story. And I think everybody needs to feel that way, that they've got a right to access this storytelling platform and to have agency over those narratives and say, my story is worth listening to, my story is of value. And if a person's story is seen of value, then they're seen of value. And if they're seen as of value, then they feel valued. So it kind of keeps going around. So the more someone feels valued in society, the more they feel able to contribute, able to change things that maybe are disempowering, and we all need a bit of hope right now, I think, that we can do that.
Have you done any writing for a particular game? Would that be something that you would do?
I would definitely do. Haven't been asked to do that, but I would definitely do that. I mean, I've been working with a couple of women in the Wyld Women group to look at possibility of a choose-your-own-adventure type game based on kind of wild woman journey, but we keep getting stuck in the valley of procrastination. There's other stories. I worked with Wyld Women. I worked alongside a publisher called Fairacre Press that brought out an anthology a couple of years ago called the Me Too Women's Poetry Anthology. I created a platform online for people to share their poems outside of the poetry anthology that had been published, and helped coordinate events and stuff. And I worked with Adam Clark and a musician called Beth Porter, and we created a video piece called What We Know Now, which was a response to the poems within that anthology. So that kind of went out there. And I'd like to look at that more as well, kind of that relationship between poetry and VR spaces. I had started, but it's now on hold, a Master's of Research with University of Highlands and Islands up in Shetland that was looking at VR and AR and poetry in telling stories of loss. So looking at landscapes of loss, whether that's sort of personal landscapes or ecological loss or heritage loss. And I think there's some really interesting potential in those areas for immersive games to develop. And I'm kind of excited to start trying.
It's really interesting. Maybe this is feels like I'm prying, but between you and Adam and the wizard and the wild concept as well, it must be a really interesting dynamic, because you must draw each other in these sort of quite different directions. That is really good for creativity in terms of he's quite digital and gaming focused, and obviously spoke to him on this podcast before, and then actually your creativity and your writing and your insights in terms of that community of women and their creative process. Not a lot of people would have that as an opportunity so accessible to be able to go, okay, well, where would you take that? Okay, you would take it there. I wouldn't even think to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've, it was all planned. When we met at school, which we did, It was all planned. It's a really exciting dynamic that it can feel difficult. I suppose it has in the past where it's like, well, I don't understand, particularly sort of like, well, that's not my world, or that's not my world. But then, like you say, sort of bring somebody in and go, well, yeah, but have you thought about that? So, and also we have, obviously we've got our son, so who's also, homeschooling as well, and he contributes a huge amount to that creative process too. I think a good example would be, we did a project a couple of years ago called Trace up in Orkney, sort of a short self-directed residency. I was looking at poetry and stories within the landscape, and Adam was looking at, could he take a VR system out into the middle of nowhere? That was his sort of, that was his, could he take a VR system out of the studio and into the natural world? So really different places that we were coming from. We went to Orkney on the sunniest year that it's ever had, of course, which we then discovered that VR systems don't like being in bright sunlight. So that was a challenge. But he was doing human scale VR and AR sketches, particularly the AR ones actually. And I was watching him do this, and he'd be sort of walking along and sort of just holding his phone, and a line would be created across the beach, or just sketching around me while I was standing on the beach, or things like that. So he was looking at how you could create these shapes and spaces in the natural world, but through AR. And I looked and I got so excited because I said, that just says to me so much about what my experience of bereavement is like. It's like, hey, what? I was like, because you've got, when somebody dies, they're present. They don't go, there's these echoes that exist everywhere. So go to a familiar space and they'll still be there. You'll have a memory of them being there. And that's how, you've got these traces of people and traces of energy. And even, when we move through space, we create a trace of energy. We upset the atoms. We leave, we change the space that we're in, which then led on to me looking at, there's a Judith Butler quote about we're the enigmatic traces. We're made up of the enigmatic traces of others. So that got me interested in kind of that idea of how we formed by the people that have gone before us, and how do we connect with the natural world, and that kind of idea of archaeological heritage and hidden history. And then Adam started looking at, well, how could you use these sort of XR spaces to explore that idea of absence, and we were just sort of both sort of colliding with all of these things, but we didn't set out to do that at all. We set out to we were both kind of going, oh, well, we're really interested in these things we're doing of our own, but then it's like we have that wonderful sort of opportunity to be able to look over our shoulder and go, well, hang on a minute. So I've started looking much more in terms of using those spaces to tell stories, and how those sort of poetry can become visually represented in that. And then he started looking more at, like, well, what was he doing in that? It wasn't just about a digital experiment. There was something else happening in there, and then how could he work with that? So aren't we lucky?
I guess with digital art, often the best work comes out when people are collaborating from completely different angles. You got artists, you got technologists, you got a philosopher and a historian, or this collision of different people coming with completely different perspectives. You need someone to drive that forward, but actually it's those influences that make it really interesting. And you've got this microcosm of that going on in your own household. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it also means that we've kind of constantly got ideas of things we can do and never quite have enough time. So about the Wyld Women thing as well, obviously Adam's been, in the background of that right from the start. And after the first series of workshops I did, I said to the women in the group, well, what would you like to do with the stuff that you've written and the stories that you've told? Do you fancy putting it into a book? And they're like, yeah. And then turned to Adam and was like, okay, how do I do that? Because I've never put a book together. Even down to that, where he's like, okay, you know, I've got my, you know, my desktop publisher, that kind of thing, and put our book together. And so he's seen sort of where I've come from and with that story, and then his creative stuff sort of developed on that side. And I've been involved with all the, you know, the Minecraft projects too as well. So, you know, I'm there I was like, but you could tell this story with it, and you could do this with it. And he tells me about games and says, well, have a look at this one, and what about that? And in a way that I suppose, you know, that helped me to be able to access games, because he was able to say, well, you know, it's not all those type of games, you know, there's this one, and how about this? And I still feel really sick as soon as I put on a VR set. I'm one of those people that it doesn't work. I have to be sat really still. I fall over as soon as I put a VR headset on. But he was able to kind of show me other types of things, and I suppose give me the confidence to be able to then approach other women who are making games and say, you know, because at first I felt like I couldn't do that because I wasn't, again, exactly that. You know, I was trying to do this project to break down that barrier, but at the same time was thinking to myself, oh, well, I can't do that because what do I know? So, and Adam said, well, it doesn't matter, just go and talk about why you're interested, because you don't have to know how to make a game to know why a game is important. And I don't need to be able to do the sort of digital wizardry that Adam does, because I bring something else to it. I bring the Wyld. The wizard and Wyld.
That was my interview with Vik Bennett. I loved that discussion and could have spoken with Vik for hours. Since recording this, I have also been reading a few of her poems, which are really interesting and quite emotive, so I would recommend having a read of her work. If you are interested in finding out more about Vik's work, this is where you can find it.
Wyld Women Press, we have a website, so it's wildwomenpress.com, and that's got all our projects on. It's got Wyld Woman Gamer as well, so that's a monthly piece that goes out featuring a new, you know, different woman contributor each time. We've just had Threefold Games have just done last month their new game Before I Forget, which is sort of looks at dementia, which is really interesting. And we have alongside that a newsletter that goes out, so you can just subscribe to that. It's free. That goes out once a month. They both go out on the first of the month, and that sort of looks at games, books, other things that we're looking at. And we've got a couple of newsletters actually. So if you go onto the website, you'll see that you can there's links there. You can subscribe to the newsletters as well. I have my work on my website, which is Wyld, so BEEWYLD.co.uk. That sort of has a selection of stuff. And they're on Twitter as well, so it's just Wyld Women Press. You can find us on Twitter. And Vik B. Wyld, again with a double E in the middle.
Thank you to Vik Bennett for being interviewed in this episode. Plus, thank you for listening. If you did like this episode, it would be great if you could subscribe to the show and rate it 5 stars on iTunes. It really helps us reach a larger audience. If you have any feedback on the show, you can also get in contact on Twitter on @TechniqueUK. Plus, we are now on Instagram, which is a new thing this month. There we are on Technique Podcast, all one word. There's not a lot of information on there just yet, but it is part of our broader plans to improve the show. So if you can follow us on there too, then that would be great. That is all the time we have for this month, but we will be back again next month with a new interview. In the meantime, take very good care of yourself. Goodbye.